Hi, this is Siofra's Magic Alcove, and I am Siofra Bradigan. So, this is just before Samhain in the Northern Hemisphere, and I decided it'd be a good idea, since the season is coming up, to talk about the season, what it means, and how difficult it can be for some people. Uh, Samhain is all about first the sun starting to go away into the dark. From the God stories, the God has died and had his funeral and is now going into the underworld to become young again so that he can be reborn at the winter solstice. But this really is about that idea of going into yourself, into the darkness inside of you, to see what is there, and also to deal with the concepts and the realities of death. Because death happens around us all the time, no matter what time of year it is, no matter whether the sun is shining and being beautiful outside or whether it's raining and stormy. Everyone has times in their lives when death comes visiting someone that they know. And it can be difficult to figure out how to process that. As a pagan, a lot of pagans believe in the summer lands and that the dead will cross over into a brighter place. Some people believe that the dead come back, depending on your particular path that you follow, to guide us and help us as we continue on with our lives. In any event, regardless of your beliefs about what happens after the fact, death of a loved one leaves a hole, and there's a space there that is now feels empty, and you miss their voice, you miss their laughter, you miss their touch, and these are things that you can't get back. So, to all of those out there, apparently I'm going to cry now, who may have lost a loved one, my heartfelt condolences. I'm sorry for your losses. But life continues on, whether we are willing participants in it or not. So, let's see. Some of the things that we do to honor the dead this time of year: writing letters to those who have crossed over, reading those letters aloud, burning them in a cauldron, processing whatever might be happening or might have happened, finding ways to let go. Some people do dumb suppers, which I've participated in, which are interesting. Ancestor worship or ancestor honoring, depending on what you're doing. A dumb supper is a unique kind of experience where you set a plate for those who've passed, and then you do the supper backwards. Walk backwards, eat the end of the meal first, work your way back to the beginning of the meal, put mementos on an altar for those who have crossed over. And I think the reason why you do it backwards is to separate it from any other meal that you might have, because it makes you think about what you're doing, so it becomes a way of focus. So, apparently I'm going to be very emotional today, so forgive me. But this is that time of year when emotions run deep, and talking about things like this bring the emotions up. So I hope if this is triggering you, feel free to turn it off and watch it at a different time, when you're feeling more together and capable of feeling the emotions. But it's tears that run free that free us from these things. Tears are the melting of the ice in the heart and allows you to move forward and to move on. And without that grief and allowing yourself to feel that grief, you can't really move forward. So I honor the dead in different ways this time of year. I consider all the people, men and women and children and animals that were murdered and tortured during what we call the burning times to be my spiritual ancestors, whether they were witches or not. So most years I read the list of the dead that I've posted on my Facebook page. So if you want to do that, feel free to take it, copy it, print it up, do it. It can be a very powerful thing to do since there are so many names and so many pages. We usually spread the pages around. The larger of a group of people you have doing it, the shorter of a time period you spend, but also the more powerful the naming of those names can be, because you'll hear certain names just pop up out of nowhere while everyone is reading from their personal lists at the same time. So that's another idea of something that you can do. And I wrote our own Samhain ritual for descending into the underworld and reconnecting with the darker parts or the forgotten parts or the hidden parts of our own psyche. And I based it on the myth of Ereshkigal and Inanna. Recently I came across like the worst retelling of that myth I'd ever seen in my life, which kind of left all the important parts out, in my opinion, like why I tell this story and what it is important, why it's important, what it teaches us about grief, and how to help someone who's going through grief. So what I've done is I've printed up a copy of the story and inserted part of the ritual that we do when I lead people into the underworld. And then what I imagined Inanna might have let go. So this is the story of Inanna and Ereshkigal. It is the myth for the season as it speaks to the descent into the underworld and the rejoining the power of the shadow self. Inanna is the queen of heaven, and her sister Ereshkigal is the queen of the underworld. Ereshkigal's consort dies. Even gods can die in the underworld. And she is consumed with grief. The gods above hear this, and Inanna wants to go to the underworld to comfort her sister. All of the gods are terrified of Ereshkigal and her power, and tell Inanna this is a bad idea. After all, her sister could kill her. Inanna decides to ignore their warnings, but sets up some safeguards before she leaves. She speaks to Ninshubar and tells her that should she not return, to go to Enki, as he will know what to do, and she leaves Damuzi, her consort, in charge of her throne room. When she begins her journey, she is all decked out in her royal regalia as Queen of Heaven. Inanna comes to the first gate. What follows are my interpretation of what gates may represent. You have reached the first gate to the underworld. You may not pass until you set aside your title, for death is the great equalizer. Inanna removes her crown that represents her title, Queen of Heaven. You have reached the second gate to the underworld. You may not pass until you set aside reason and your perception of who you are, for the underworld is a place beyond our ability to comprehend with the mind alone. Inanna removes her necklace, setting aside all reason and understanding. You have reached the third gate to the underworld. You may not pass until you set aside your determination and focus, for the underworld has no need for deeds and glory. Inanna removes her bracelets, setting aside her will. You have reached the fourth gate to the Underworld. You may not pass until you set aside your attachment to the world of the living, for the journey to the Underworld is one that each of us must do utterly alone. Inanna removes her outer dress and steps away from the world of the living. You have reached the fifth gate to the Underworld. You may not pass until you set aside fear, for death is the great annihilator, and fear cannot exist amongst the dead. Inanna removes her rings. You have reached the sixth gate of the Underworld. You may not pass until you set aside your sexual identity, for the dead are sexless. Inanna removes her girdle. You have reached the seventh and final gate to the Underworld. You may not pass until you set aside your desire to be, to exist as an individual, for the dead return to the source of all that is, without individual identity. Inanna removes her undergarments and steps out of her shoes to be welcomed into the Underworld as all of us are in death, nameless and naked. In order to descend, we must give up the things of life. So Inanna, now naked, goes before her sister Ereshkigal to try and comfort her. But Ereshkigal is insane with grief and believes that Inanna has come to mock her loss. In her grief, she lashes out and kills Inanna, staking her naked body in her throne room for all to see. 3 days pass. Inanna does not return. So Ninshubur goes to Enki to tell him what has happened. Enki takes the dirt out from under his broad square fingernails and creates two beings whose sole purpose is to empathize and reflect. Since they are not technically alive, they pass through without challenge and enter into Ereshkigal's chamber to find her yelling, screaming, and crying in her grief about how unfair it all is. They yell, scream, and cry with her and reflect all of her grief without fail. She tears at her face and pulls at her hair, and they do the same. Seeing them reflect her grief, she sees herself, and Ereshkigal's madness begins to fade. She slowly comes back to herself and realizes what she has done, and that her sister Inanna had come not to mock, but to support. She brings Inanna back to life. Now there is a problem, however, because once someone dies in the Underworld, their space cannot be completely abandoned. A space has been made that must be filled. Inanna agrees that she will send someone in her place and returns through the 7 gates, gaining back her royal regalia as she rises. When she comes back to her court, she finds her consort Dumuzi enjoying her absence with the court ladies, and it becomes clear who should go in her place. Dumuzi has a twin sister, and he begs her to share his fate, and she agrees. So for 6 months he lives in the Underworld, and for 6 months his sister takes his place. This story is one of the most important myths for the coming season. It speaks to a time when the goddess had already been artificially split between the dark and the light. Her descent and subsequent rise back to the upper world empowers both Inanna and Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal gains her sanity back when Inanna descends into her world, bringing the world above in, and Inanna gains back some of her other self, for at one point in history they were one goddess, not two. The plight of Dumuzi and his sister speaks to the split between the male and female psyche within each of us, and how they need to rejoin, for this is our current plight. It also teaches us that grief is a powerful, raw, and irrational condition that no amount of logic can pierce. Only through empathy can we help others find their way back to life and sanity. So, this is the story of Ereshkigal and Inanna, and I retell it this time every year because myths have the power to help us to live our lives and to understand who we are and how we feel and how to find our way back. So this has been Siofra Bradigan, and this has been Siofra's Magic Alcove. Blessed be.